Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the World City Summit 2021 webinars. I am your MC, Genevieve. Thank you for joining us at Making Sense, Leveraging the Science of Cities. In a few moments, I will introduce Mr. Peter Ho, Chairman of Singapore's Urban Redevelopment Authority, URA, to give a keynote address. This will be followed by a moderated discussion with our panelists and audience Q&A. Simultaneous interpretation in Mandarin is available for this webinar. To access this, click on the Interpretation tab on your Zoom toolbar and then select Chinese. Some of you have already submitted questions to our speakers in advance, but you can also ask questions using the Q&A tab. If you need any help, please use the raise hand function. We are very honored to have Mr. Peter Ho, Chairman of URA, here with us to give the keynote address for this session. Mr. Ho, please.
All right. Good day to all of you, and thank you for joining this webinar of the World Cities Summit. And we're going to be touching this afternoon on the theme Making Sense, Leveraging the Science of Cities. Cities, like all human systems, are enormously complex. And in her influential book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, the world-famous urbanist Jane Jacobs wrote, and I quote, "City processes in real life are too complex to be routine, too particularized for applications as abstractions. They are always made up of interactions among unique combination of particulars, and there's no substitute for knowing the particulars." Indeed, cities are complex in large part because they are made up of millions of people. In the parlance of complexity science, these people are agents. In each city, every person, every agent interacts with countless others, but these interactions are usually hidden from view and very often unpredictable in nature. So the aggregate result of these countless interactions can defy analysis and produce outcomes that will confound and astonish. Jane Jacobs' insight defines the challenge. To understand how a city works, we must understand not only the behavior of each person living in it, but also how they interact with one another, and then how they behave as a whole. Given the state of science in the past, this would have seemed an enormous, even insurmountable challenge, but the situation is changing. Jeffrey West, a former president of the Santa Fe Institute, and who is at the center of efforts to develop a science of cities, explains in his marvelous book, Scale, that, and I quote, "Almost all theories of the city are largely qualitative, developed from focused studies on specific cities or groups of cities, and supplemented by narratives, anecdotes, and intuition. They are rarely systematic and typically do not integrate issues of infrastructure with those of socio-economic dynamics," unquote. Yet, this is precisely what Jeffrey West and others are now trying to do, to understand the deep structure of the city and its defining patterns. He argues that we cannot make our cities work better until we know how they work. But this might seem a quixotic ambition, given how complex cities are. Cities are often disorganized, even chaotic. How is it possible to uncover commonalities, regularities, and behavioral patterns in cities as diverse as Singapore, Mumbai, New York, and Shanghai? For hundreds of years, the basic approach to understanding complex systems was reductionism. It reduces complex systems like cities into smaller and simpler parts that are easier to study analyze, and evaluate. Instead of studying cities as a whole, their complex problems are sliced and diced into digestible pieces, such as into functional areas like transport, environment, energy, public health, social dynamics, economics, and so on. But there's a flaw in this approach. The big assumption is that when the smaller parts are reassembled, the whole will behave like the sum of its parts, that in aggregate, the results will approximate the real world. But unfortunately, outside the realm of the hard sciences, reductionism has not been very useful predicting the holistic behavior of complex systems like cities, whether they will flourish or fail. It is not too difficult to understand why. The ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu instinctively grasped the complex nature of the world when he wrote that everything is connected and everything relates to each other, which is an observation repeated many centuries later by Leonardo da Vinci and then by Lenin. Agents, the people, are not independent. Instead, they are interdependent. They interact and influence each other in ways that defy a deterministic or linear analysis. Their interactions lead to outcomes that are inherently unpredictable ex ante and that are only revealed when they occur. In other words, we only know what is going to happen when it happens. This is the property of emergence, which characterize all complex systems. As a result of emergence, complex systems are prone to the law of unintended consequences. An intervention in a complex system can create unanticipated and often undesirable outcomes. An obvious example can be found in transport. Traffic congestion, deaths and injuries from car accidents, air pollution, and global warming are all unintended consequences of the invention and large-scale adoption of the automobile. Unintended consequences can result from failing to appreciate that non-native animals, like the infamous cane toad, introduced into complex and delicately balanced environments to control pests, can become pests themselves. Then there is the failure to consider human behavior itself. When the British government in India offered rewards for people who killed cobras, the unexpected outcome was a new cottage industry. People began breeding the snakes. Then when the reward was scrapped, the population of cobras in India surged as people released the ones they had bred. This phenomenon of the outcome being the opposite of the intended one is now known as the cobra effect. So it is important to look at complex systems, not just in their component parts, but also together as a whole. In Singapore today, government-funded urban research requires research proposals to incorporate a social or behavioral component. But for a very long time, investigating the features of complex systems like cities at a holistic level was eschewed in favor of investigating the properties of the components. It was easier, and the scientific tools for analysis at the micro level were already available. Part of the reason for this is that the scientists have been conditioned over centuries of reductionism to dissect the complex world into smaller and less complex parts, and to favor explanations framed at the lowest level of scale. However, more recently, efforts to study the overall properties of complex systems have begun to attract interest. Pioneers like Geoffrey West and his colleague Louis Bettencourt are turning away from the micro properties. They are now looking at problems of complexity holistically, acknowledging that the properties of higher level entities like cities are often quite distinct and unrelated to those of the components that constitute them. This is a radical departure from studying problems within disciplinary silos. It is a holistic approach in which academic silos are collapsed in favor of interdisciplinary and integrative study. Interdisciplinary study achieves a holistic understanding, not by rejecting reductionism, but by building on it. That combination of holism and reductionism makes it possible for interdisciplinary study to address the big challenges of today, including, of course, urbanization. It is an irony that this is a singular case of the science playing catch up with the practice rather than vice versa. In Singapore, like in countless cities around the world, the urban planning process considers the complexity of packing in housing, green space, industrial land, commercial and retail space, land for transportation needs and other public infrastructure like hospitals, roads, and power stations. This process involves integrating the perspectives of economic, social, and development agencies, as well as consultations with various stakeholders in the private sector and the general public. This whole of government approach is in essence an interdisciplinary approach to planning that enables all stakeholders to better understand interdependencies and implications of land use and strategic decisions. The irony is that this interdisciplinary approach has occurred without a parallel foundation in an integrative science of cities, at least until now. The challenge of taking an interdisciplinary approach was compounded by the lack of the tools for looking at complex systems holistically. But the situation is changing. There are now complexity science tools that include agent-based modeling, which examines how agents in a complex system interact with one another and influence system behavior. These tools, when applied to cities, are beginning to provide fresh and usable insights that deterministic models have failed to produce. In Singapore, government agencies are already using such tools in areas such as land transportation, health, and housing. And after several years of working with such tools, these agencies have developed a common vocabulary and acquired some confidence in the utility of these tools. This is a major step towards establishing a science of cities as a foundation for urban planning. Furthermore, the availability of data to assist in the quantitative as opposed to the qualitative study of cities has grown significantly in recent years. Indeed, there is so much data being generated now that the amount of data created over the next 3 years will be more than the data created over the past 30 years. The agents within a city, the people, public and private institutions, markets, and networks all generate a lot of data. The Internet of Things produces enormous amounts of data from an ever-increasing network of interconnected sensors that also interface with and impact the real world. All this constitutes what we now refer to as big data. The revolution is that we now have the technology both to capture big data as well as to process it. Singapore's Smart Nation initiative is in essence an exercise to systematically capture this big data. When combined with high-performance computing, increasingly powerful data analytics, and artificial intelligence, such big data can be converted into useful content to discover new patterns and trends. This is a truly powerful capability that is vital to the development of the science of cities. The tools of complexity science, combined with the insights from big data, can help us to understand how the city works, to enable us to identify when and how to intervene before problems arise. They allow us to see the city differently through new lenses. What then are the fresh possibilities to imagine and shape a different and better city for the future? And if we can imagine a different city of the future, we can take active steps towards realizing it. This is what a good science of cities should be able to achieve. In Singapore, there's no shortage of research into urban matters. The Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, the Singapore ETH Center's Future Cities Laboratory, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and a host of other university-based centers, laboratories, and institutions study aspects of the urban setting. The next step is to integrate such research, combining the reductionist with the holistic. In time, this will evolve into the science of cities that Geoffrey West and others are championing. Already in Singapore, the Center for Livable City is taking the lead to integrate the efforts of these various research institutes using new tools of complexity science. Others have begun to embrace this holistic approach. One is the Government Office for Science in the UK. In 2013, it launched the Foresight Future of Cities project. Its concluding report, entitled Future of Cities, the Science of Cities and Future Research Priorities, examined how cities work by adopting a systems-level approach of cities, both city systems and systems of cities, cutting across multiple scales, local to national, and sectors, people, organizations, resources, land, infrastructure, with an emphasis on understanding the interdependencies between city systems. This neatly frames the study of cities in holistic terms and is a contribution to the growing body of work to develop a science of cities. In complex systems like cities, exploration and experimentation are often more valuable than relying on prediction of analytical models. There needs to be a willingness to try things out, to experiment with new approaches and solutions. The approach is to probe, sense patterns, and to act, even in the absence of complete information. Pilot programs, demonstrators, prototypes, and beta versions should be embraced as a foundational approach to deal with complex systems. And if they work, they are evidence that the hypothesis can be scaled up. If they fail, well, then the damage is limited. In Singapore, this approach is adopted for some complex urban challenges. In preparing for climate change, we are piloting the use of polders in order to protect a large island, Pulau Tekong, against rising sea levels, while at the same time proving that the cost of land reclamation can be reduced at the same time. We are prepared to experiment on scale. Whole districts like the Punggol Digital District for the smart digital economy and the Tengah Forest Town for sustainability will become living laboratories for researchers and companies to pilot new ideas and solutions, and for people to explore and embrace new lifestyles. In 2016, a floating solar photovoltaic system was test-bedded at Tengah Reservoir. With its success, the pilot was scaled up 60 times to create one of the world's largest floating solar farms. And this will power our local water treatment plants, making Singapore's waterworks one of the very few in the world to go 100% green. As Geoffrey West observes, the future of humanity and the long-term sustainability of the planet are inextricably linked to the fate of our cities. This is a compelling reason to develop a science of cities that can provide a framework for understanding how they work and what drives their growth and functioning. Many of the building blocks for science of cities are already in place. We have long experience in studying cities at the component level. The next step is to study them holistically. For the first time, this appears possible. The tools of complexity science are steadily improving. Big data is now available, and the technology to collect and analyze it is there. Together, these should be a spur to assemble and integrate the different building blocks with a new science of cities superimposed on it. It should not just be an interdisciplinary approach, but also through a practical approach of partnerships among companies, government agencies, and communities in pilots, demonstrators, and experiments. Strategically directed funding can shift research in this direction. In Singapore, the Urban Solutions and Sustainability Research domain is a major funding platform that is already being deployed to support efforts to build a new science of cities. The hope and the ambition is that it will produce new knowledge through research and experiment that can lead to the development of better plans and policies to ensure our future livability and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ho. With that, let us dive right into our speaker sharing for Making Sense, Leveraging the Science of Cities. It is with great pleasure I introduce our moderator for this session, Mr. Aaron Maniam, Deputy Secretary, Ministry of Communications and Information, Singapore. I will now leave the next segment in his capable hands. Mr. Maniam, please.
Thank you so very much, Genevieve, and thank you very much, Mr. Ho, for that wonderful, and expansive vision that you painted for us in terms of what exactly science of cities might look like. I thought you covered such a wonderful range of stuff, ABM, agent-based models, big data, system level thinking, holistic thinking, all of which feed into the culture of experimentation and the creation of living labs that cities can be. What I asked our panelists to do is to have a think about a question that might respond to this issue of the science of cities. I've asked them all to think about the biggest insight that they've had from the science of cities so far, and also what's one outstanding question that the science of cities has not yet been able to answer for them, so that we can see both what the science has achieved as well as what new things it might be able to suggest to us and what new questions it might pose. So we've got a wonderful panel of 4 today who are going to share some of their thoughts on this with us. And then after that, we'll have some time for question and answer as well as a discussion amongst the panelists. We're going to start with Mayor Daniel Plato, who is the executive mayor of Cape Town, right? A very active city in many ways. And I'm really looking forward to Mayor Plato's views on the practitioner perspective, right, of what a science of cities can do, as well as what new questions it might raise for us. So without any further ado, let me invite Mayor Plato to please share his thoughts with us on the science of cities, what is given him in terms of insights, as well as the outstanding questions that it might have for him. Thanks.
Good morning. It is morning down here in Cape Town, and a very informative session, very important for the city of Cape Town as well. Let me first and foremost say that with regard to the topic, the complexities of cities, and also with regard to the data-led systems approach and that sort of thing. The city of Cape Town as part of Africa, part of South Africa, very, very difficult issues for us also dealing with COVID-19 and that sort of thing. But I think the city of Cape Town is up to the task with regard to its data, science and that sort of thing to deal with many of the complex issues. It was important for me when I stepped in as mayor of the city of Cape Town to do away with the stereotyping, siloed style of doing business in the city of Cape Town, and to work more in a transversal kind of a team consisting of professionals and that sort of thing, and to making use of the brain power around in the city, like the universities, and to work very closely with our universities and to make use of that advice as far as possible. And I can say to you, the benefits of doing of going into that approach is dramatically for the city of Cape Town insofar as that we can provide the necessary services to our people. You must realize and remember the primary duty task of any municipality, and that counts for municipalities across the world, is to make sure that all the necessary services is provided to the public. And for me, during these trying times, it is equally important to make sure that that is done, that is realized, that there is that we stop issues such as load shedding. We went through a stage of what we call day zero to prevent that there's no water in the taps, clean drinking water for the public to drink. We sailed through that dramatic stage in our history. The drought is behind us, and we can looking forward to the future. And with all the brain power we collect to come and assist, we can now showcase to the whole world out there of how best to do that, and how best we can advise other cities around the world to prevent any drought that they might face. But also the issues with regard to land, the issues with regard to housing. It's a dramatic topic for the city of Cape Town. How we deal with land use matters, land use issues, but also how to provide the necessary shelter to a much growing population out there. So in saying that, the concentration of human resources, the concentration of brain power assists the city of Cape Town to deal with all of these highly contentious matters. The ethos of the city of Cape Town is clear: infrastructure-led economic development. And I can say to you, it is working. Transport, housing, property management issues, land matters, also how to grow our economy, the behavior, as Mr. Ho have put it, and that sort of thing, of the people in the city, looking at that complex matter, all different racial groupings and so forth, different people from across the world and from Africa putting base in city of Cape Town. I think the city of Cape Town is at a stage where we can say yes, to bring all the brain power together to assist us with the future. It helps an awful lot, and that minimize complexities and issues for the city moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Plato. I think that was a wonderful set of insights there that you shared. I was particularly struck by the idea of transversal connections, right, which I thought linked very much to Peter Ho's notion of whole of government thinking and connections across entire systems, which clearly are important ways of bringing the adaptivity and agility of cities into full being. We're going to move on now to Professor Tim Stonor, who's the managing director of a group called Space Syntax, right, which studies human behavior patterns and how people move, interact, as well as transact across spaces, particularly in cities. And I was very struck by this description of what his group does, because I think that fits entirely with what Peter Ho mentioned, in terms of the importance of agents in cities, right? That cities are organisms of organisms, and the multiple agents within them create complex interdependencies amongst themselves. So Tim, we're looking forward very much to your thoughts on the biggest insight that the science of cities has given you, as well as any outstanding questions that are still in your head that the science has not answered yet.
Thanks, Aaron, and hello, everyone. It's a real privilege to be given this opportunity to share my insights and also some concerns about the science of cities and how it is still to embed itself in everyday practice. As an architect and as an urban planner, my principal concern has always been how cities work for people ultimately, and how we can therefore better make them work for people. How do their streets and public spaces connect to facilitate everyday social and economic contact? And so at Space Syntax, we've been developing smart cities computer modeling techniques for over 30 years, well before the days of big data, I have to say, to understand the deep structures that Peter Ho referenced so that we can then plan them better. We've recently published this walkability index to show whether existing development is going to work to encourage people to walk or not. And what we've learned through studying the connectedness of cities, the way land uses attract people, the way transport infrastructure supports movement, is that connected walkable cities are not only good for low carbon mobility, they're also good for real estate value. They work to create jobs. They work to support investment. And I think that's really important that we bring the real estate community with us in our discussion. interdisciplinary working must be at the heart of smart cities. So computer modeling of street connectedness combined with analysis of public health data, for example, has revealed the important impacts on health of connected or disconnected places. Disconnected places more likely to increase physical obesity at great cost and great pain to society. Not only physical health, but mental health too. If you live in a less connected, more remote place, it's harder to form a social network. And over time, by working with other agencies and bringing our data together, we've learned that people are more likely to report being lonely when they live in these spatially isolated places. So bringing these findings together and working positively to plan and design the future of cities, we have learned to integrate, not just integrate the disciplines working on cities. So it's not just the architects, the planners, the transport engineers, but it's also working with the health practitioners, the landscapers, integrating places, integrating mobility, creating infrastructure such as this, a bridge over railway tracks that's lined with buildings, building agent-based models that have been referred to plan cities as networks of streets, parks, and public spaces, heavily planted to produce the shade and the cooling that will facilitate the movement of people on foot, as well as, of course, the biodiversity of non-human species. And if I could focus on one element, one insight to push a direction for the future of cities, it would be the street, and not just the street, but the main street. We've allowed our main streets to become dominated by fast traffic. Instead, we need to redesign them for slow speed movement. Yes, for private vehicles still, but also for walking and cycling, because streets should be places of social contact. And so when my clients ask where to start to think about the complexity and apparent chaos of cities, I often say to start at the street. Think of streets as places for people first, vehicles second, people socially and economically transacting. And of course, Singapore, if I turn to my host, Singapore has all these potentials to be an ever more walkable nation. And computer modeling of street connectedness in Singapore is allowing us to identify where those pedestrian movement potentials are, or where they can be created through new planning and design. And so the insight is the importance of connectedness, the importance of the connections of the city to generate those social and economic interactions, and to allow cities to help us solve our problems by bringing people together to discuss them in public space. The challenge is to make these techniques, make the science prevalent, so it isn't just a few leading people in academia and in practice, but it's everyone embracing digital technology. And we can talk about how to make that happen perhaps later, but I think it does involve making these data sets and modeling techniques far more available. So I hope those insights have been helpful for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. You know, I was so struck by the focus in your remarks on humanness, right, on people and the centrality that they have here. I remember meeting Jan Gehl once in Copenhagen, and him saying something along the lines of, we need to stop designing cities for cars and start designing them for people again, right? And I think that spirit is so animating in all of your remarks. We're going to move next, actually, to Eva Gladek, who's the founder and CEO of a group called Metabolic, a consulting research and venture firm that tackles global sustainability issues, as well as tries to advance the idea of the circular economy. And I'm really interested in this because if we take where both Mayor Plato and Tim have taken us so far, right? We've been talking a lot about people and the coordination amongst public sector agencies. Eva, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how these fit together and create this more circular flow, right, of ideas and of people, but also of sustainable practices were illuminated for you so far. Thanks, Eva.
Great, thank you, Aaron. I don't know if there we go. So I have some opening remarks that are more general about the type of work that we do at Metabolic, and indeed connect very much to the themes that we've heard about so far. Very much enjoyed the opening remarks from Mr. Peter Ho. It's a pleasure to be here and kickstart this conversation on how cities can be leveraged to drive resilience, circularity, and sustainability, in addition to the other things we've been discussing. Metabolic is a group of organizations working to drive systems change towards sustainability. So we advise governments and businesses, we crunch data, we build tools, we develop on-the-ground projects and ventures, all in service of this bigger goal. And one of our thematic focal areas, understandably, is the redevelopment of cities. So cities only occupy 3% of global land surface, but are home to the majority of human populations. Can someone please go to the next slide? They are the main centers of innovation and also indirectly or directly responsible for most of humanity's environmental impacts. They consume 75% of global material resources, so they act as a major resource sink. And that's why we call them a leverage point, because if we're able to change the way that this 3% of the planet is organized and designed, we can actually solve many of the challenges of the Anthropocene. So we need to bring the operation of our cities within planetary boundaries while at the same time boosting human well-being. And it is indeed these different tools around the science of cities that need to be leveraged to achieve that. So an important element to consider is how cities relate to global land use, zooming out a little bit outside of the boundaries of the city itself. So though they only occupy a small area themselves, they draw on vast hinterlands dedicated to agriculture, industrial activity, and sprawling infrastructure. Currently, there's only 23% of wilderness remaining on the planet. And scientists have found that actually to maintain key ecosystem functions, we need at least half of the Earth's land to be kept in a wild state. So this means that we need to design our cities to be producers instead of just consumers. They have to move from being resource drains in a linear economy to resource roundabouts, where materials that enter cities become part of new local value chains. They have to become greener, integrated with productive peri-urban and urban areas, designed to support diverse communities of citizens that can actually collectively realize these circular value chains. In this future state, cities will have much less reliance on material resources from outside of their borders through the use of new technologies and the development of these local value chains. But this transition is not possible without changes in urban planning and infrastructure, social organization, and shifts in mindset. And all of these things have to be brought together through this integrated holistic systems lens. So how can we leverage the science of cities to move towards such a vision? At Metabolic, we have developed a systems transformation methodology that's visualized here in these 5 steps. The first step is always to analyze the current state of how a city is functioning. So we look at many different aspects. We look at material flows, we look at spatial distribution of resources, of demographics, of air quality. So there's a lot of data that goes into this kind of baseline current state analysis to understand the city as an organism, understand its metabolism. Then we work with local stakeholders to set a holistic future vision of how the city should develop. We always use many different indicators, not just focusing on climate or social aspects, because there's always a risk of externalities of fixing one problem while creating a new other problem. And then if you have your current state and your future state, you're able to plot a route between the two, and we're able to backcast from that future vision to develop a roadmap of interventions for the transition to take place. Now, this results in an integrated planning approach that addresses the many layers of how a city operates, everything from the hardware of the city to the software. So by hardware, meaning physical infrastructure, and software, communities, relationships, governance models. We have done a great deal of work in our home city of Amsterdam, and I'm just going to quickly walk through a few little examples. A thorough understanding of the resource flows within the city. So shown here, we conducted the kind of baseline analysis, was the basis for the integrated area development strategies that we've rolled out, including this neighborhood called Bauxel Durham, which was designated as the first circular living lab within Amsterdam. In this neighborhood, we co-developed multiple sustainable urban projects, such as De Keuvel, so this is one of those, and Schoonschip, both of which are real-world implementations of circularity, resilience, and community-led development. And through these types of projects, we're continuously shifting from scale, across scales, where we're working on the level of whole cities to neighborhoods to actual green building projects. We're actually able to continuously learn and iterate on the practices we're developing and share that knowledge and create new models that can be transitioned, so that can be applied by other parties. So I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you and this discussion today. Thank you.
Eva, thanks so much. So many wonderful echoes and resonances between what you just talked about, in terms of fixing problems and creating new ones with the unintended consequences that Peter mentioned earlier, and then your integrated planning approach and how that links actually to Peter's remarks, but also Mayor Plato's remarks, as well as Tim's remarks, right, about the importance of system level coordination and really tying things together in the overall adaptive system. So I can really see lots of common themes that are emerging here. Our last, but by far from least, speaker on the panel is Cashfya Cazi, who is the global technology leader for urban strategies at Jacobs. She's an economist by training and works on a huge amount on sustainable infrastructure, project development, linking that to urban design, renewable energy, and health. And I can see already, a huge connection there between what she's doing and the multidisciplinary sort of approaches that have been recommended by so many of our speakers before this. So Cashfya, if you could share your thoughts with us, please, on what the science of cities has given you insight on and what it's left you wondering about.
Absolutely. And I think my approach will probably try to bridge together everything that everybody else has been talking about, primarily from how we actually practically do that in terms of companies that are actually helping clients and cities to be able to develop that. So one of the things that we've sort of probably worked on the most is trying to understand how we balance the economics and the planning and the transportation and how we actually connect people between cities, and understand that there's more to the value to it than how we would traditionally value it in terms of just the purely financial and commercial values, but what is the social value? So looking at our approach to analysis with a triple bottom line. So how do we look at it from an economic, environmental, and social impacts that cities have? And when we are doing this, we try and look at it from a multidisciplinary approach. So very much what Mr. Peter Ho was talking about, it is the cities and how we tackle cities are definitely systems of systems, and how we learn from history and nature and biomimicry by example. And for example, even when we were working on Masdar City about 10 or 15 years ago now, we looked at how traditional concepts within the Middle East used wind towers to be able to cool the cities that were around them. These are very traditional cities built, over 400 to 600 years ago. And we use those concepts to create that in a modern environment within Masdar. Now then, taking that a step further, as we now look at what are the challenges, how do we bring together the best of architects, economists, engineers, master planners, sociologists, demographers, how do we uniquely bring them all together, integrate it, and look at it from a holistic point of view? So not have it as sequential analysis of a master plan and a business plan, but actually really working together. So when we look at the science of social value and how we can create value across a project life cycle, whether it's in a town center that's being regenerated in the north of UK to encourage what we consider leveling up, so that you redistribute the wealth between the south and the north, whether you're looking at an industrial park that's lying on the fringes of the Borneo forest in Sarawak, or we look at metropolis designs in the heart of an existing Australian city. All of these things look at a systematic approach of systems. And one of the things that we've been focusing on a lot is incorporating geodesign methodology. So we look at what our clients would be looking for example, the Enfield Council and the Meridian Water Program. In that approach, what we did was we spoke to the stakeholders, so everybody around, including the council, and what their objectives were and what their vision was. So very much echoing what Eva was talking about in terms of the methodology. And once we've got that, we started looking through the data sets that we could absorb from. So creating a platform that brought together geotechnical, architectural, climate, economic, social, transport, all of those data sets, they were combined. And we agreed with the council in terms of assumptions and project targets and basically targets that they would like to achieve. And we tested that against the master plan. And as we did that, we also created essentially 3D maps and 2D maps and graphs that actually were put on a portal that allowed the council and allowed the rest of the stakeholders to make their decisions as to what option would be the ideal option as we go forward. So by doing this, by combining our data sets with all our disciplines, what we had was looking at a project through improving the quality of life, sustainability, and resilience, primarily the resilience, making it equitable throughout the city structure. We're fostering collaboration, we're enabling informed design and interdisciplinary solutions, while also maximizing efficiencies and engagement, because what we're looking at is not just the value or the economic value or the commercial value, but how do we add on to the social value? How do you actually measure the intangibles? How do you bring that all together to be able to provide a solution and a future that is equitable, sustainable, resilient, and primarily intelligent? So how do we take redefining smart as the way we think about it as in terms of smart technology, but actually integrating it with every aspect of society? And so that's how we'd like to be able to pursue this going forward as well. And I welcome the opportunity to be able to speak to the rest of the panelists about this as well.
Cashfya, thank you so much. I'm really happy that you brought in the vocabulary, of resilience, of adaptability, of design, because I think those things fit so well with the kind of human-centered approaches that all of our speakers have talked about so far. And you're quite right? This is what gives intelligence a dynamic quality. Right, and it's not just it doesn't leave smart cities as being a purely technocratic sort of phenomenon. So we've had some really wonderful stimulus material now from a great keynote, and then 4 panelists who've shared their thoughts with us. I wanted to plunge straight into some questions that we've been receiving. The organizers have been very eager, and so they've had questions come in pre-session for the last week, and we've also got questions that are coming in via the Q&A from Zoom, the Zoom webinar, all of which makes my job both wonderful, but also slightly hard because I have to find ways to merge all of these questions. But there are some really interesting congruences and commonalities amongst the questions. But before we get to that, I wanted to just show you the results of the poll that was sent to you earlier. The question posed to you was, what does the science of cities mean to you? And this is itself a complex phenomenon, right? And you were given a few different options. So our organizers are going to share the results with us now. This will be the first time that all of us are seeing it. So, we'll probably get some interesting insights from it. Can I hand over to the organizers to show us the results of the poll, please? So I'm just looking at this. So we've got using big data, option A is 37%, improving urban life using smart sensors and devices, 21%, creating scientific models and laws to predict how cities behave, 26%, and I'm not really sure, so I'm here to find out more at 15%. That's probably a good set of honest answers, actually. And I'm quite struck by the fact that, apart from the I'm not really sure, who hopefully will feel a bit different by the time that the panel is actually done, we have got a reasonable number from the other 3 options. And of course, in a lot of ways, as all our speakers have shown us, the science of cities is itself complex and multidisciplinary. So it encompasses all of those different things, but being brought together, right, in a way that is holistic and where each of those different sets of components actually becomes mutually complementary. And I thought that was very revealing to see that there was a good fair amount of representation, I think, for each of the different options. So bearing that in mind, right, that we're thinking a lot about data, but scientific method and process, as well as other ways of organizing the scope of cities, I wanted to start with a question that was sent to us a week ago by Melissa Chan from the Government Technology Agency of Singapore. Her question was, how do the results of spatial and city planning map to citizens' experiences and reflect people's concerns? So this is a fundamental issue here about the importance of individual human experiences, right, and how they factor in to the overall process of city planning. And because I don't like to keep things too simple, I wanted to connect this to something that Simon Lovegrove actually brought up in the Q&A early on, where he mentioned the example of London, right, where he talked about how London is, let me find the exact idea that he talked about. London was formed by combining towns and villages, right? And the maintenance of these components is actually what creates the livability. And this is more about people than planning. I was very struck by that view, that this is more about people than planning, because I think what Simon and Melissa are both asking us is, how do we factor in, right, the importance of people into this whole process of urban planning? And what can urban planning do that is actually affecting these overall people and human related outcomes? So if I can ask the panel to reflect a bit on that, right, we can go a bit deeper on this issue of human-centeredness and how exactly people feature in this whole process. Maybe we could start with Mayor Plato, if you don't mind. We'll go in the same order in which you all spoke. I'd love to hear your thoughts, in particular how in Cape Town some of this work has been done. You're on mute, Mayor Plato, so you may need to unmute before you.
Thank you very much. Very important question. Just a couple of observations from my side. As you know, coming from a very dramatic apartheid past and with different racial groups scattered across the city of Cape Town, scattered across South Africa, it was quite a daunting task in bringing people together. We are not there in Cape Town and in South Africa where we want to be. The divides is still, those of you that visit South Africa in the past and Cape Town in particular, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. And looking at all the speakers, the input from the speakers, it was as if you were really talking to Cape Town and to say to Cape Town, we are having a specific message for you. So, but what I was trying to do in my short address, to say exactly what you have said, the holistic approach of not to decide for people, but to bring people together. I think Mrs. Cazi was quite specific with regard to that one. And to sit around the table and to carve out the future. It's important. We're a young democracy, 29 years in the new dispensation and things like that, and we're still reeling against the ropes with regard to our apartheid spatial planning, apartheid spatial development, and to bring that together, to get it out of the way, and to say people are just people, and people just want to move on with their lives and that sort of thing. But it's a case of a dramatic, lot of people type it as the have-nots, and with a small grouping of people as the haves. And how are you going to bring those different breeds of people together? So for us, what I've said is, yes, we pay an awful lot of attention to break down all of those stereotypes and to say our spatial planning, our city planning, we need to begin to focus on the human factor, and to say that if we want to achieve a unified South Africa, it is, and a unified Cape Town, it is very, very important to begin to focus on those issues and to make sure our spatial planning is correct for the next 50 to 100 years. I like this London referral. the villages and the towns to be brought together to create the new London and that sort of thing. And I think that is a direction Cape Town and South Africa will have to move towards. The divides was just massive and that sort of thing. But I think we're busy getting there. I think we had to say to our people, this country belongs to all of us, the city belongs to all of us. We're all living and working in the city. It is important to bring those on the outskirts of Cape Town, outskirts of villages, to bring them into the city, to make them part of the city, to create the necessary infrastructure for those people in the outskirts as well, to broaden the scope within the inner city of Cape Town or in the inner city of all our metropolitan municipalities, for those on the outskirts to feel they are part of. Currently, even today in the new dispensation, many of our people is of the opinion they are not part of yet. And spatial planning, future spatial planning, future city planning for us is key. Infrastructure-led economic development is key to make those issues to realize. I want to stop with that. That for me, from where I'm sitting in the heart of Cape Town, is the most important issue, and that is to create a new South Africa. To create a South Africa and a Cape Town to say where everybody living and working in it can say it is our city. We are really, for the very first time, we are now part of it. And that is what is important for me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mayor Plato. I think if a lot of what you said distills to this notion of inclusion, right? That people need to feel included in the process, and that we need to make sure that divides are minimized while the dividend of being in a smart city is actually maximized and shared amongst as many people as possible. So thank you very much for that. Tim, let's move to you now. Where do people fit into the main street, given that that was such an important part of your presentation?
Yeah, well, it might not be a surprise for anyone to hear me say they fit right in the middle of this. And I like this theme very much. If I could try and develop two angles to it, the first would be to include people in the process of planning and to connect people as a consequence of planning. So many of the challenges that we see in cities as practitioners are related to poor connection, poor connectivity, as Mayor Plato, I think, was describing, that we need to bring people to the heart of the city, and we need to bring the heart of the city to people at the edges. It's a two-way process of connecting. That requires us to think differently about transport planning, about where we think about the CBD being at the middle. We have to think about local centres much more, and get back to that process of villages, of cities as villages. Certainly London, as Simon identified, was a city of villages. You could equally take Paris, you could take Berlin, you could take so many cities. What they each did was, as those villages grew together, they didn't create walls between them, they created boulevards between them. And that's fundamental, the main street as the connector. We are all, as a species, naturally cautious of those we don't know. And the people around the corner or on the other side of the tracks, we are cautious of. The more we can connect and get to know each other, the more we understand the benefits of the integration that space can make. Maybe just one little point, if I could say, my organization's first clients were community members concerned at what was being offered to them by real estate developers. And the community came to us and said, could we help them talk to, work against, stand up in court against, and then eventually work directly with these real estate developers to help them think differently about not building barriers, but about making connections.
Thank you, Tim. I love that. And I think there's so many ideas there around the inclusiveness as well as the connectivity of the planning process that is useful. In Singapore, we think a lot about a process that we're calling emerging stronger together. that is very COVID related, but it's also about involving citizens in the planning process as much as possible, not just on urban planning writ large, but also on specific policy domains. Because I agree with you that the scope for connectivity is really important there. And in the process of that, a lot of social capital actually gets created, and we build a lot of resilience into, I think, the overall system that the cities are trying to govern. Eva, let's move to you now. Where do people fit into the overall circular and overall sustainable model that you and the team at Metabolic actually aim to create?
Well, once again, as has already been said, absolutely centrally, right? I was triggered by a number of things that were raised in those two questions, and one of them is that typically with top-down planning processes right now that are taken on by municipalities, we often get things very wrong. There's zones that are defined as, okay, this is going to be a big zone for commercial, and this is going to be a big zone for residential, et cetera. And it creates these very artificial patches and blocks that would never have evolved naturally. Like if you look at old city centers, there's a lot of commonalities in the patterns that you see. It's almost like looking at bacterial colonies that grow naturally in a kind of needs-driven way. They grow toward resources that are available, and actually city infrastructure has this same awesome fractal design if you look at really old cities that have evolved on their own. And when we try to take a kind of top-down planning approach, we often fall into these reductionist patterns where we think, okay, well, we need this much schooling, this much housing, et cetera. And I think that that's actually a huge loss in how we're, that is also an evidence of humans being cut out of the process, because it's not the kind of human needs and human desires that are being manifested physically. It's more kind of this computational approach. So I actually think that in order to make, like the approaches that have been discussed so far, about including people in the decision-making process and really that kind of engagement, that's one way to really ensure that humans are centrally represented in the future development of cities. But if we really lean into this kind of emerging science of cities and the system science, another approach is to really use evolutionary planning practices to actually, rather than saying top down, okay, well, these are gonna be commercial zones and these are gonna be residential, to allow anything to develop based on what's needed. Does there need to be a shop here? Is that function missing? But really create more guardrails and kind of principles. And encoded into those principles, you can include certainly social performance criteria, but also environmental performance criteria. So as long as you conform to, for example, being a zero waste and net zero energy building, and you perform certain functions that are in line with what is needed, you can build anything. Now imagine unleashing that kind of creativity and the responsiveness of what communities need into planning and development. That would be an incredible way to leverage both the new science of cities as well as really tapping into people's needs on a granular level.
Thank you so much, Eva. This is rapidly becoming the favorite panel that I've ever had the privilege to moderate, because it's when you have words like fractal and evolutionary and resilient and complexity and adaptive all coming together, I really think that there's so much there that's about a new science, right, of how we are approaching a world that is complex and interdependent. So this is great. I am so enjoying where this discussion is going. I hope that those of you who are watching, the 1,000 or so people who have apparently signed up, that you're all enjoying this whole process as well. Cashfya, let's come to you now. I suspect I know what your answer is going to be, but tell us where people fit into your approach here with the science of cities.
Yeah, should I just go off completely off the track and just say, no, absolutely not. We won't talk to the people at all. No, no. So very much in line with everybody else. For example, I think stakeholder engagement and actually speaking to the people, it's so important in part of our processes. One of the recent projects we had done about a couple of years ago was the Edinburgh City Centre Transformation Program. And as part of that, one of the first stages that we had was actually go out there and speak to the people living within Edinburgh. So we had over, I think, eventually we ended up with over 4,000 responses from residents and from people who are also just visiting tourists. And Edinburgh being the way it is, it's got 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites within the city centre. You've got cobblestones, you've got immense amounts of stairs all over the place. And you've got tourism. You've got a festival that comes through yearly in the summer. And so you've got an influx of tourists and then an outflux of the actual residents. So we actually really spent a lot of time trying to get their input as to what the residents would want out of the city center. What they basically said was, well, we'd like to have much more pedestrian. It's exactly what Tim was talking about, that pedestrian access, that ability to be able to actually walk on the streets, to be able to cycle places rather than taking the cars. And so we did this entire engagement with them, looked through the options to try and see how do we curtail off the city center from traffic. And then went back to the public again with the options. And then eventually the final option that we went with was voted positively by over 80% of the respondents anyway. And so that was where we actually engaged everybody within the public, came up with a solution so that now within the main center of Edinburgh, you won't see any cars going around. And so that's how we think that it's essentially important to engage with them. And you know, echoing what everybody else was saying, it is the heart of the street.
Yeah. Cashfya, thank you very, very much. I think Tim had a quick thought that he wanted to jump in on now, but yeah, move to the next question. Tim?
Thanks, Aaron. Just briefly, I think as well as talking to people, we should study people. Jan Gale, who was referenced earlier, said, we know more about the behaviors of mountain gorillas than we do about the behaviors of our own species, because we don't study anthropologically urban behavior. And so strapping cameras to lampposts and making paper-based surveys using mobile data, these are all the insights that allow us to actually understand what people need, where the pedestrian crossing should be, where the benches should be, how much shade we need. We really need to have a science of human understanding in order to better plan our cities.
Tim, you've now continued what I said earlier. You've used the word anthropology, right? In this, and I just think I fully agree with that, right? The ethnographic approaches are so important because that small, thick data complements the big data that Peter Ho mentioned in his lecture. And when you put those together, I think that's when we really get some very, very powerful insight coming out, you know, about what exactly these organisms in the city, as well as cities as organisms, can function as. So we've talked a lot about people so far. I wanted to go to a question that Margaret Tan asked in the also on the Q&A spiel. She posed a question about how she loves the idea of spaces being there for social contact. But what do we do about COVID-19, right? Given that social contact is now so much more difficult. And I think this is an important question for us to answer because, of course, COVID is the big elephant, not even in the room, right? It's out there in the whole universe for all of us. It's weighing at the back of all of our minds. And I feel like no panel would be complete if we didn't have at least one COVID-19 question. But let's tackle that a bit. How do we be human-centered at a time when actually bringing people together in all the ways that you've referenced, all four of you, is actually much harder to do for public health reasons? Do you mind if we go in reverse order this time? Cashfya, can I put you on the spot to start with this and then we can work backwards?
Absolutely, yeah, no. I think one of the things that we've actually also realized is from a health perspective and how we look at health planning in hospitals particularly, and the spaces that are required for recovery and how open spaces actually help you with recovery. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because we have public spaces that you can't have people coming together. It's allowing them to have enough space to still interact and have access to fresh air and green space and everything that goes with having a piece of mental peace and mental health of having that access to that open space that we should be concentrating on. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have an open park that you're going to have a concert of 20,000 people there. It is giving them that access, and which we've seen so much throughout COVID, is having that, that accessibility to a green space within even a city environment has given people that sort of, you know, as Tim was referring to, that loneliness that we felt when we would be isolated. At least being able to have that open space allows you to see and interact with others. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it in throngs, but even with that limited interaction, it gives you that mental health.
Right. So safe distancing rather than social distancing necessarily, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting. Eva, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, to build on that, one of the things I didn't actually really get to answer your original question about my biggest insights from the science of cities, because I prepared a quite different intro speech. But actually, some of that is one of the biggest things I learned is that urban infrastructure, the way that it's designed and the way buildings are designed can really predict well-being outcomes. And that's borne out by the data that Tim showed as well on isolation and loneliness. And I think that it's not just about, walkability and connectivity, but also how we design buildings themselves. Are there opportunities for people to encounter one another? Is that designed into the environment? Are there common spaces? Are there courtyards? These kinds of elements. And that can really have a predictive effect on people's well-being, as well as, of course, access to green space. So when it comes to COVID, of course, we're trying to limit close proximity interaction indoors where people are exposed to the same air. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be opportunities for safe interaction outside with fresh air. And it's very possible to design perfectly safe environments where you can encounter smaller numbers of people in well-ventilated spaces to continue maintaining that sense of well-being and connectivity without compromising COVID, and without compromising safety. And I think that this is something that really requires us to prioritize more public space rather than less. So there's a lot of space in cities that's being taken up by vehicles, being taken up by private uses, private gardens. And I think in city design we should be prioritizing more public space that allows for this benefit to be shared by everyone, and for the connectivity and the social connection to be actually baked into the way that buildings are designed.
So that brings us back to that notion of actually the very intentional and deliberate design of spaces, right? That brings in both the safety aspects and the connectivity aspects at the same time. Thanks very much, Eva. We actually had another question from Maria-Leen Verdict on how we intend to bring the heart and the people back to cities that have been ravaged by COVID. And I hope that you're finding that these answers actually go some way to responding to that, Maria-Leen. Shall we move to Tim now? And then we'll have Mayor Plato after that.
Thanks, Aaron. And I'm glad Margaret raised this question, because much as I'm sure all of us would like to move beyond COVID, we're not going to. It's going to be with us for some time. And what I'm seeing in architecture and urban design practice is the way buildings and cities are adapting with COVID. So buildings in which we can open windows, buildings in which the ground floor opens onto the street, streets that have seats and benches. Perhaps the most obvious manifestation of the response to COVID was restaurants moving outdoors, and people then realizing how, in most cases, wonderful this was. And what we have lost over the last 50 years of air conditioning, of sealing ourselves into buildings and boxes, of going through that wall from the public space to the private. And this is genuinely leading to rethinking not only about the health necessities of staying safe, but also the opportunities to bring cities back to what they always have been, which is machines of human interaction that drive our economies, that drive our societies, that drive innovations when people meet, have unexpected conversations that lead to ideas that have never been had before, that lead to invention, that allow us to move forward. This is actually the upside of COVID. And I think it's something which, if we respond well, will be with us for a long time to come in a good way, despite the negativities of COVID itself.
Thanks so much, Tim. Mayor Plato, shall we move to you?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the big problem or issue for us in South Africa and the whole of Africa is to get our population vaccinated as soon as possible. I think that is a kind of a little stumbling block for us, but we're busy getting there. And look, issues around space in South Africa and the rest of Africa, not really a problem. Lots of open spaces, lots of parks, lots of forestries available for people to go and take a walk, take a jog, and that sort of thing. The big problem in, as you know, in parts of Africa, also down here in Cape Town, in a forest or in a veld, when it is summertime, is the fear for snakes and other species and that sort of thing. But I'm very pleased to say that we're in a different category than many other towns and metropolitan municipalities across the world, due to the fact that massive open spaces is available, even buildings to open windows and that sort of thing is not, definitely for us, not a problem. I just want to see our economy to open. I just want to see more businesses to begin to operate, for people to earn a living, and a salary, and for them to buy their little piece of bread and that sort of thing. That is always part of Africa, being in Africa and Africa's problem. That is why this is my tone of my message to the rest of the world, just to give you a little bit of insight of some of the problems we experience in this part of the world. But I think I'm on par with all the sentiments raised from the panelists so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all four of you. I thought that was a fascinating response to this crisis and this pandemic, which is on all of our minds in such a deep and heavy way. We've talked a lot about that current reality. I wanted to take a question that takes us a bit into the future now, and we've got a fascinating question here from Serge Lambermont about how a lot of the data that we look at, right, in analyzing cities, is based on existing infrastructure, and that's based on current legacy trends, right? Motor vehicles, working in the office, combining towns through the processes of organic development that Simon mentioned in his question. But how do we also design for future trends that aren't even here with us fully yet, right? Personal mobility devices, the sharing economy, on-demand delivery, and other things that are leveraging digital tech in new ways, right? Work from home, digital nomad work, urban gardens. I thought this was a great question to do, and kind of as a third question, because we've looked at the present. Now let's project into the future for a bit here, and ask ourselves, how do we cope with these emergent trends that we haven't fully actually understood, and that have not been fully taken on board in the world of policy. Do any of you want to start on this? We don't have to have a fixed order to this, but I wonder if that question about the future resonated with any of you particularly. Eva?
I'm happy to,
yeah.
Sorry?
Go for it, please, yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's true that the data that we have now that we're collecting is going to reflect the current reality. But that's also, we need to have an iterative mindset as we move forward. As things get adopted, we should see what's happening and really update our data sets and our models, and then adjust. So this is the way that we have to move forward in general, because none of us can predict the future. It's very difficult to predict how these complex new trends and technologies will actually propagate through the human population. So that's the general approach that I would recommend.
Right. So an overall constant learning and evolutionary approach, right? Cashfya, I wonder if we can go to you on this, because you actually use the words learning and kind of dynamic intelligence in your initial remarks. Did you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was like, so one of the things that would be actually something that we'd want to be able to incorporate is like, sort of like our smart personae, or what we call, user-centric designs, right? So when it's very much working through that iterative process of, you look through your specific end users, the aspirations of those end users, and then you use, we were talking about anthropology and demographics, actually, to be able to understand how that evolution of the demography will evolve within that city context. Who are those people? Who is that next generation? And what are their likely uses? That's how we can go back and keep doing it over and over again, and which is something that we do already. We've been doing that for the last 30 years as well. And there's no reason why we should stop. It is definitely something where we start looking through the aspirations and the triggers, the economic triggers, or the growth factors that show you where the users are going to be and what they're going to be using, and trying to incorporate that back in.
Yeah, so maybe just really quickly to add to what I said, systems dynamics modeling is a way that you can really get some predictive insight into what might happen. And as we get better models of how cities are currently functioning, then we can also better predict how they might change with new introductions of technology. And then we have the empirical data to continue to steer. So
yeah. And that's helping us even towards, like, sort of, for example, how we plan towards health, that predictive analytics of consumers and what they're consuming at this point and the diseases that we're likely to see because of their consumptions now. And therefore, how do you plan the hospital in the future to be able to incorporate that? So you plan for certain, like ailments more so than the traditional ailments, because that's what we know that the demography is evolving towards.
Mm. Tim, how do you do this at Space Syntax? Because if you're studying human behavior, you're looking at that behavior in response to these emergent trends, right? Whether technological or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. What's the future going to be like? Because it's kind of our day job to help our clients imagine the future, and it's perilous because when you look back over the history of architectural imagination of cities in the sky and floating cars and all sorts of crazy ideas, there's very few of them have emerged. What we've ended up with are traffic jams, air pollution, social segregation, and profound depletion of the natural environment. So I think you go into this with a great degree of humility, is the first thing to say. If I could offer some thoughts, I think definitely, the best way to look at the future is to turn your head over your shoulder from time to time and check on the past, not just the recent past, but the long past. Because if we look at the recent past, we're looking at car-based planning, we're looking at highly centralized planning based on theories of agglomeration, which seem to always favor the center and never the edge. So I think we have to go beyond the recent past and look at how villages became towns, towns became cities, in some of the ways I described earlier about how places connect together as they grow and connect up together. If I do venture some thoughts about the future, I've written down 5 elements here, which I think we will see a lot of in the future. And the first is shade. Shade, I hope natural shade, the biophilic shade that reduces air temperature and facilitates walking and outdoor activity. We've denuded our cities of shade and turned them into sterile environments. Second is addressing the risks of water. Generally the risks of flooding, but equally the risks of lack of water. And so seeing water in cities and seeing us manage water to make it a positive and not a negative. Third, slow speed, so that we avoid the city of highways and we build the city of the high volume, slow speed, main street. Fourth, streets, main street streets. Thank you. And my last theme is localism. And that's bringing back the village to the city, if I could put it that way. And I'll let others imagine what that might look like. But, let's work on this together and make it happen. But it's about being closer to home.
I think you've given me some ideas on what a potential webinar for next year's World City Summit could actually look like here. What are the cities of the future going to have? And if everybody came with a list of 5 like that, Tim, we'd have some very, very rich discussions. Mayor Plato, let's come to you now. How are you in Cape Town meeting both the current needs of your citizens while also making sure that you prepare for the future and anticipate that future?
Well, lovely listening to the 3 previous colleagues. Very importantly for the city of Cape Town, look, we can see and feel the changing trend in our city already. Exactly what you are saying is happening. Working from home, more and more of the staff members, and this is my part of the practicalities we experience as a metropolitan municipality. How to prepare ourselves for staff members and even senior staff members from working from home. That is a changing trend we need to manage as a city, as leaders. We're living really in changing times because we see more and more deliveries of medicine. Because Cashfya was talking about clinics and hospitals and that new issue. In our system currently, we made space for that to happen on a more official kind of a basis. People don't need to go to a hospital or to a pharmacy or to a clinic to collect their medicine. It gets delivered to them in a very specific manner. But also the changing of our policies, exactly what Tim are talking about. Our policies needs to align itself with the new current trends, the new changing world and that sort of thing. Very importantly, but also our data. We pick up data of 2 months ago. Is not the same data actually today. You need to brace yourselves to make sure you're on top of the world with regard to your data people, that they provide you with the correct data, and that the data must follow what is happening in the world. But also how we work, or also our economy, how we deal with our economy, with business. On the planning front, we see more and more businesses apply to the city of Cape Town to start working from home, to start working from a garage, to have their office at home and that sort of thing. COVID is responsible for bringing all of these issues to the fore, and the municipality needs to fit itself in with regard to what it is you approve, etc., with regard to what is currently in policy. It's a scramble for our policymakers to go and change policies to fit in with the changing current world that was very quickly bestowed upon us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all four of you, for those extremely insightful ideas, both in terms of the concepts, but also the operationalization and the practice of that. We have just above 5 minutes left for this panel segment. I'm going to pose all of you a question. I'll give you some time to think about it while I try and not summarize, but at least share the key themes that I was struck by in today's panel. And then I'm going to ask each of you to respond to that question. And the question really is, if you had to just give everybody a tweet, right? So not long, right? 288 characters max, maybe 144. If you had to do a tweet of the one thing you want the audience to not forget from today's discussion, what is that going to be? Right? And I know it's challenging because, you know, as with all good design, constraints are there to create creativity. So your constraint is, it's a tweet. It's not an essay. It's not even a full sentence. It's a tweet. While you think about that, and we'll do this in the same order that you started in. So Mayor Plato, Tim, Eva, and then Cashfya. While you think about that, I just wanted to share kind of 4 thoughts that I was very struck by as I listened to all of you and as we went through the different questions. And that's really if we are really asking ourselves but what a science of cities is and what it can do for us, then I think we need to answer 4 questions. The first is, what does that science involve? The second is, how do we do that science? The third is, where does that science take place? And the fourth is, who does the science involve? On the first question, I think we talked a lot about data, but we also talked a lot about people. And it's striking to me that we want the science to involve both of those things, right? That the pure quantitative methodology is not enough. We need the qualitative, the ethnographic, the anthropological to come in as well, because that is finally, in the final reckoning, going to be the subject of this science of cities. How do we do that science? I love the fact that we went through the importance of interdisciplinary work, of bringing in, again, you know, ethnographic approaches, but also design approaches, and making sure that no particular area of knowledge or domain is privileged. We need evolutionary approaches and biophilic approaches as much as we need mathematical modeling. And I think that kind of richness, right, that methodological pluralism is really going to be a source of great insight for what we try and do in the science of cities in the future. I also was thinking quite a bit about where this science will occur, right? Where are the platforms of this science? And you know, Peter Ho mentioned the importance of living labs, right? That actually the space out there is our laboratory. Cities are themselves laboratories. And I think really that's where we're getting at, right? That this science is not one that takes place in a hermetically sealed area, in a neat little room somewhere. But the whole world is our lab here, and we need to be testing in that world because the science takes place everywhere, not just in small selective spaces. And then finally, I think the who question is important. We spent so much time talking about people at the heart of this science. And these people, for me, it's critical, not just because of the inclusion ideas that we talked about or the participatory policy making that many of you referred to, but also because to do the science of cities well, we will need the right skills, people with the right experiences and talents, but also the right culture and dispositions, right, to create a space where they can be emergent and experiment and pivot across different beta drafts wherever necessary. So I think if we keep focusing on these questions, right, the what, the how, the where, and the who, we'll keep fleshing out what the idea of this science can be, and hopefully it'll provide even more rich insights to all of us. So that was my attempt to not quite summarize, but at least share my impressions of where the panel has got to today. I would love to hear your parting shots in this tweet length intervention. So it really should take each of you about 30 seconds before we hand back to Genevieve as our master of ceremonies. So Mayor Plato, you get to go first. what is your tweet length reminder to everybody that you don't want them to forget?
Very important for me is if I can summarize what I have said already, and that is when we plan from a municipality point of view and from where I'm sitting as mayor of the city of Cape Town, do your planning for your people and making sure that you plan in such a way that you don't infringe with the normal workings of your community and of your people on a day-to-day basis, but your plan must be for your people you serve as a mayor, as a municipality. Thank you.
That's great. So plan for people and their needs. Fantastic. Tim.
I've written mine down. Think of a city as a transaction machine, helping people flow effectively and to come together in streets, parks, and public spaces for social and economic interactions that will drive the innovations that will shape a better future. 234 characters.
Very nicely done. Thank you, Tim. So cities as transaction machines leading to all of those very positive consequences. Great. Thank you. Eva?
Much less eloquent, but similar in spirit to what Tim just said, that ensuring strong communities and supporting human well-being is both the critical input and the key outcome of urban planning for resilience and environmental sustainability. So essentially, even though we want to achieve environmental sustainability and resilience, we can't do that without focusing on the human element first and ensuring those strong communities.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Eva. And finally, but far from least, Cashfya.
I think it would be design and engineer natural space so that we're balancing quality of life, sustainability, and resilience by using technology as a facilitator.
Thank you so much, Cashfya. I love the combination of verbs there, right? Design and engineer. It's not design or engineer, but bring both together, right? And have the insights come and be synthesized in the most powerful possible ways. Thank you very much, all four of you. This has been a fascinating panel. I love the building that you all did and how much you worked in with each other's ideas. Like I said, this has now become my favorite panel that I've ever moderated because it's got all my favorite, not just buzzwords, but deep areas of substance in it. So I'm very grateful to all of you. Thank you very much to Peter Ho as well for starting us off and giving us so much to work with in your keynote. Let me hand you back to Genevieve now, who will kind of take us through the last and final bits of today's program.
Thank you, Mayor Daniel Plato, Professor Tim Stonor, Ms. Eva Gladek, Ms. Cashfya Cazi, and Mr. Aaron Maniam for this insightful discussion. We have now come to the end of this session. Playbacks of this session will be available on our YouTube channel, where you can also find other videos of the WCS 2021 session. Do register for upcoming World City Summit webinar sessions, which are happening from now until November. The next session will be Planning for a Rainy Day, Climate Ready Cities on 23rd September 2021. You may register for the next session using the QR code or link on the screen. Before you leave, please use the QR code or link to fill in our feedback form. Until our next session, goodbye.